In the opulent rooms of the Royal Alcazar of Madrid on the 6th of November, 1661, Queen Mariana of Austria held in her arms her newborn son, a son whose birth would be the tragic turning point for an empire. This wizened and apparently deformed infant would mature into one of the saddest figures in European royal history, Charles II of Spain. His jutting jaw, dull stare, and ghastly pallor were not accidents of nature. They were dire portents that the great Habsburg dynasty was crumbling to its foundations. This is the shocking true history of a king whose very flesh carried the injuries inflicted over centuries of inbreeding. Charles II wasn't just born with physical disabilities. He was the living product of a genetic experiment that had gone horribly wrong. The courtiers' murmurs that day weren't about the appearance of the child. They were the beginnings of the whispers of doom for a once impregnable empire. As the queen clutched her son tightly, overcome with equal measures of love and horror, she must have realized this was not only her heir, but the personification of a royal house in final decline. The Habsburgs had reached their own genetic breaking point. What had started generations ago as a deliberate scheme to unify European power through strategic royal marriages had devolved into a nightmare, a continuous cycle of incestuous marriages that gradually poisoned the family tree. And now, the price of that ambition was starkly evident in the frail, distorted form of a newborn prince. Doctors at court were shocked. Charles's skull was abnormally large, his limbs thin, and his tongue constantly protruded from his mouth because of a drastically underdeveloped jaw. The notorious Habsburg jaw, once a royal trademark of the house, had in him become grotesquely enlarged so that he had trouble articulating speech or eating solid food. A once proud symbol of imperial might had degenerated into a heartless husk of nature's defiance. News of the prince's health spread rapidly throughout Europe, mouthed among diplomats and scrawled in clandestine letters. Shock and incredulity rang out through foreign courts as competing monarchs sniffed out a golden opportunity. The Spanish throne, once the pinnacle of world power, now threatened with being ruled by a king who was hardly able to act as a man. It was not just a scandal. It was a cataclysmic change in the balance of power in Europe. But Charles's tragic birth was no isolated incident. It was the inevitable product of a centuries-long obsession with bloodline purity. For generations, the Habsburgs had married close relatives, siblings, uncles, nieces, and cousins, all in the name of keeping power tightly bound within the family. The result? A royal lineage riddled with deformities, disease, and dysfunction. Queen Mariana, while secretly heartbroken at the state of her son, determined to protect him from the world that would view him as some kind of freak. She clung tenaciously to the hope that Charles might rule, that Spain might continue under his governance. Her mother love was both a solace and a bane to her, keeping her son safe and shielding the court from facing the cold reality of his inability to do so. Her passion, while wild, couldn't reverse centuries of genetic deterioration. Charles's birth did more than mark the beginning of a marred existence. It marked the end of an era. The Spanish Golden Age, an age of breathtaking art, military, and economic supremacy, was withering under the strain of its own imperial hubris. The son born to inherit the world's greatest empire would instead become its unwitting destroyer, a tragic reminder of power unrestrained. But to really comprehend how the great Habsburg Empire came to such a disastrous end, we must travel back to the start, to the great rise of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain, a story that started with brilliant strategy and imperial dreams, only to end in irrevocable destruction. It began in 1516 when Charles I, subsequently the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, inherited the throne of Spain from his maternal grandfather Ferdinand of Aragon. This was the beginning of Spain's Golden Age, an age during which the empire reached across the world and its ruler was purported to rule over territories where the sun never set. Charles I was all that Charles II would not be: brilliant, authoritative, and politically talented. During Charles I's reign, conquistadors pushed Spain's influence into the New World, bringing back enormous amounts of gold and silver treasures. The Spanish court awed Europe, establishing the standards in politics, fashion, and the arts. Charles's son, Philip II, continued the family's tradition from the breathtaking El Escorial Palace, a stunning monument to Catholic power and royal splendor. Spain's empire reached out across continents, from Europe to America to Asia. Even the mighty Spanish Armada was a terror in the making, a testament to the nation's maritime dominance. Yet all this glistening facade concealed was danger on the quiet. To keep their far-reaching empire together, the Habsburgs set about intermarrying with increasing fervor. Philip II married his niece, Mary of England, and subsequently his cousin, Anna of Austria. These unions at the time appeared master strokes, uniting lands, avoiding competing claims, and keeping Catholicism dominant. However, every union placed another level of genetic weakness. The shining wealth pouring in from the colonies produced an aura of invincibility. Nobles lived lavish lifestyles, building palaces and patronizing artists such as El Greco and Velázquez. Spain's court was on par with Renaissance Italy in art supremacy. However, under the grace and opulence, a genetic time bomb was ticking. Philip III, the son of Philip II, was one of the first to display worrisome signs of hereditary deterioration. While less obviously afflicted than Charles II was later to be, he suffered mental instability and bodily weakness, initial intimations of the storm that was brewing. Nevertheless, the empire was still large enough to conceal these ominous portents. While other royal families experimented with consanguineous unions, none had done so with the same fanatical fervor as the Habsburgs. Cousin married cousin, uncle married niece, all in the interest of maintaining the so-called purity of their blood. The family tree, rather than spreading out, became warped and knotted. By the early 17th century, the Spanish Habsburgs were preeminent in the world, wallowing in unparalleled power, oblivious to the fact that their greatest asset had already planted the seeds of their demise. The low-grade genetic catastrophe of the Habsburg family was no longer a secret vulnerability. It was an irrefutable crisis. The damage was surfacing in ways that shocked even the most seasoned observers and would ultimately lead to the downfall of the most powerful empire the world had ever known. The birth of Charles II, the final tragic embodiment of this biological unraveling, was no accident. It was the climax of a centuries-long experiment in royal inbreeding gone catastrophically wrong. With Philip III, however, the cracks in the dynasty's supposedly unbreakable foundation started to open up. Unlike his predecessors, Philip did not have the energy or ability for active rule. He left most of his powers to favorites and ministers and opted to concentrate on religious ceremonies and hunting trips. This change inaugurated a perilous development. The downfall from active imperial rule to passive monarchy, grown more and more aloof from the state which it was intended to administer. Even Philip's physical health manifested symptoms of increasing hereditary defects. His jaw, the notorious Habsburg sign, had become more pronounced, and he was beset by mysterious afflictions that baffled his physicians. His lack of ability to focus for extended periods indicated mental deficiencies that would become horribly prevalent throughout his heirs. While Philip III sat on the throne, Spain suffered its first serious military and economic setbacks. The long-running Dutch revolt drained resources, while the 30 Years' War pushed the empire's military and finances to their limits. The seemingly endless influx of silver and gold from the Americas, once Spain's lifeblood, sparked rampant inflation and created a dependency on colonial wealth that couldn't last forever. Philip's marriage to his cousin Margaret of Austria carried on the dynasty's fixation on blood purity. The price was terrible. Several of their children died in infancy or early childhood, and survivors often were born with physical or mental defects that the court attempted desperately to cover up. Officials hid these facts from the public and foreign diplomats in an attempt to maintain the facade of royal virility. Within the palaces, ceremony increasingly took the place of leadership. The pomp and rituals of the Spanish court, once badges of imperial refinement, now had a darker intent: to conceal the monarchy's increasing dysfunction. Sophisticated etiquette permitted kings to seem regal while diminishing their real role in ruling. Meanwhile, the Spanish Inquisition, instituted to protect religious purity, became more and more an instrument of terror, silencing anyone who dared speak of the royal family's advancing debilitation or the perils of inbreeding. Criticizing the dynasty's health could result in accusations of heresy or even execution. Nevertheless, foreign ambassadors did observe. Rumors filtered back to European thrones detailing unusual behaviors, grotesque deformities, and a strange pall that seemed to surround the Spanish monarchs. But most wrote off these reports as political hyperbole or anti-Catholic scaremongering. Spain's military strength and colonial wealth still inspired world respect, at least temporarily. But by the latter years of Philip III's reign, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Courtiers began to dread every royal pregnancy. With each new birth came fear, not joy, fear of what genetic horror might emerge next. The once revered Habsburgs, once seen as chosen by God, now seemed cursed by nature. And then came Philip IV, a monarch who marked the point of no return. Born in 1605, Philip IV showed the most extreme manifestations of hereditary decline yet. His portraits, beautifully painted by Diego Velázquez, depicted a dignified monarch, but they were skillfully constructed deceptions. Behind the kingly canvas stood a man who had to contend with crippling physical and mental incapacities. Court records and eyewitness testimony report a king whose mental faculties rapidly softened with age and whose health was weak from the beginning. Philip IV's marriage to his niece, Mariana of Austria, was the Habsburg dynasty's worst genetic mistake. Their family trees were so intertwined that their marriage practically guaranteed biological catastrophe for their children. If court genealogists had told the truth, They could have foretold the havoc that ensued, but political avarice beat biological prudence. The royal pair experienced a string of tragic miscarriages. There were several pregnancies that ended in stillbirth or miscarriage. Infants were born with deformities so extreme they died within days or months. Even jaded courtiers, well accustomed to Habsburg peculiarities, were appalled by the visible devastation in the handful of children who survived. They were appalled only by the silence that accompanied it. Nothing was to be spoken out loud. The face of power had to be maintained, regardless of reality. Philip IV himself was not immune to its effects. With age, his health disintegrated and his mental acuity declined. Foreign ambassadors remarked that the king tended to look lost at times in state councils, unable to follow complicated matters. His legendary melancholy, and so movingly depicted in Velázquez's works, might not have been caused by the burden of sovereignty alone, but by a fundamental inherited despair. Under Philip IV, the empire started its last descent. The loss of Portugal, accumulating defeats in Europe, and a spiraling economic crisis were a grim reflection. Spain was being headed by a man who could no longer head it. The once effective bureaucracy became bloated and ailing. Corruption ran through the empire's veins like rot. At the center of this crisis was Queen Mariana. Her recurrent miscarriages and children's deaths turned into causes of superstitious fear within the palace. Murmurs of a divine curse increased, spoken in darkness. Was God punishing the Habsburgs for violating the natural order? In 1651, hope flickered. Birth of Margarita Teresa, a healthy-appearing daughter, provided a temporary respite. The hope was short-lived, however. She was then betrothed to her uncle, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, a chilling indication that the cycle of inbreeding would run unchecked. Then, in 1657, was born Prince Philip Prospero. Physicians at court were overjoyed. Finally, a healthy male heir, or so it appeared. In a few brief years, the child's health deteriorated. He died at only 4, sending the court into despondency and again igniting the feeling that Spain's fate was careening wildly out of control. With his death, pressure was again mounted on Queen Mariana. Her last pregnancy would determine the destiny of an empire and give birth to one of history's most pitiable monarchs, Charles II. From the start, the pregnancy that would give birth to Charles II chilled the Spanish court. Queen Mariana, in her early 20s still, was already a shadow of her former self, drained physically and emotionally by a succession of barren pregnancies and loss of her only son. This, however, was different, somber, foreboding. There were unusual complications that baffled court doctors, whose archaic practices rendered them powerless. Month after month, Mariana's condition grew more precarious, as if the very body itself was fighting the child within. Whispers of fear circulated within the palace. The queen's agony was undeniable, her terror infectious. She seemed to instinctively know what others would only learn afterwards. This child would not be like the rest. Nearing her due date, arrangements were made with macabre secrecy. Rooms were locked away, guards doubled, and superstition filled the air. While this was happening, King Philip IV, already psychologically disintegrating, commanded zealous religious rites throughout Spain, hoping to placate an apparently wrathful God. When labor at last commenced on the 6th of November, 1661, Mariana's anguished cries rang out behind palace walls, frightening even the experienced midwives.
What was delivered that night was not the source of joy the court had pleaded for. Rather, terror engulfed the royal chambers. The new prince was appallingly deformed. His jaw so misshapen that his mouth could not close, his tongue bloated and hanging out. Feeding him appeared all but impossible. Queen Mariana fainted upon seeing her son, information the official chronicles mitigated as mere fatigue. The lavish celebrations to greet the heir were discreetly cancelled. Only a select few courtiers were allowed to behold the infant, and what they beheld reduced them to silence. A new royal etiquette was conceived that day, not to glorify Charles, but to conceal the secret of his condition at all costs. And yet, in spite of his extreme deformities and weakness, the child survived those harrowing first few days, an event that many described as miraculous, others unexplainable. Without a legitimate medical reason, rumors of divine intervention or the forces of darkness ran through palace corridors. The Spanish Empire had an heir, but not the one they had wished for. The task now was enormous: how to introduce this deformed child to the world as a future king. The court's response was to deceive. Access to Charles was strictly limited. Official portraits were specially retouched to cover up his deformities. And so, Spain started a perilous farce. Feigning their heir was well when secretly falling into despair. But the reality could not be concealed forever. Charles's early life was characterized by a constant parade of medical crises. Due to his deformed jaw and palate, he was unable to nurse normally. A changing arsenal of homemade feeding devices was required to sustain him. And even as he increased in size, it became evident Charles wasn't growing up like other kids. By the time the majority of the infants were beginning to display recognition and responsiveness, Charles was silent, remote, and unnaturally still. His eyes were big and unfocused and appeared to gaze through individuals instead of at them. He did not crawl or walk on his own, his spindly legs collapsing beneath the bulk of his deformed skull. If he did move at all, it was in a lurching, unsteady motion that kept everyone tense. His efforts at speech were no more fruitful. The hideous swelling of his tongue, combined with the skeletal defect of his face, rendered even the most basic words unintelligible. Queen Mariana, holding fast to hope, spent countless hours endeavoring to instruct him in language, only to be left repeatedly with agonizing disappointment. She was emotionally devastated. She had envisioned creating a future for Spain, only to find that she had given birth to its greatest challenge. Her correspondence during this period, scrupulously saved in Spanish archives, documents a woman torn apart by grief, remorse, and despair. Court life accommodated Charles's limitations. Special tutors were hired, not to learn him about governance and diplomacy, but to teach him survival. The aspiration of raising a monarch was far behind. What was left now was mere desperate effort at keeping up the royal illusion. And while King Philip IV observed his son struggle with even the most elementary tasks, he vacillated between public denial and private despondency. He went on insisting publicly that Charles was becoming strong and wise, while in secret, he urged physicians and priests to look for miraculous remedies. In 1665, disaster and emergency converged. King Philip IV passed away, and Charles II, only 4 years old, was anointed King of Spain. It was a coronation that ushered in not victory, but disaster. The ceremony had been constructed with great care to keep his disability hidden. The crown had to be adjusted to accommodate his abnormally large head. He required physical assistance to stand. He couldn't speak the vows of kingship, so they spoke for him. The validity of his reign was immediately called into question. Foreign ambassadors were appalled. The French ambassador likened Charles to a monster more animal than man. The English called him mad beyond reason. These stories spread rapidly, injuring Spain's reputation abroad. Allies became cautious. Enemies seized opportunity. In the meantime, Queen Mariana governed as regent, attempting to keep a disintegrating empire afloat. Behind her back, government officials sought to authenticate Charles's signature and impersonate his authority. The farce continued. Spain now had a king in title only. And it revealed. Spain's army started to disintegrate. In the War of Devolution, France won priceless land. There were rebellions in Sicily and elsewhere, unopposed. Corruption grew rampant. Commerce stagnated. The once formidable Spanish navy, master of seas, declined sharply. Spain's empire was decaying from within. The religious hierarchy as well lost faith. Some priests muttered that Charles's ailment was God's revenge on the Habsburgs for pride and incest. Even the Spanish Inquisition secretly looked into whether Charles's disease was of supernatural origin. Queen Mariana became more and more desperate, trying every remedy she had heard of, commissioning pilgrimages, and pleading for divine help. But her son continued to grow worse. As Charles grew older, the nobles saw what Mariana had dreaded. The king would never produce an heir. With no heir to inherit, Spain's elites turned against one another, vying for favor and control in the certain post-Habsburg future. Faction took the place of cohesion. The imperial court was a war zone of rumored plots. Worse still, Charles's condition could no longer be kept hidden from the public. Rumors swept through cities and villages that the king was under a curse, that he was not human, that God had withdrawn his favor from Spain. The divine aura that had clasped Habsburg kings was lost, replaced by doubt and fear. Charles's adolescence saw further deterioration. His disabilities increased as he grew older. His poor physical coordination deteriorated. His incapacity to chew food made him undernourished despite round-the-clock medical care. He starved slowly amidst royal feasts. His speech was still virtually non-existent. Those around him could occasionally interpret his sounds, but communication was out of the question. Each royal edict, each diplomatic dispatch was dictated by regents. When puberty came, the question became impossible to escape. Could Charles father an heir? The reply, breathed only in hidden rooms, was no. His bodily deformities rendered him sexually unable. But the Spanish dynasty, eager to maintain the illusion of continuity, contracted a politically necessary marriage to Marie-Louise of Orleans in 1679. Marie-Louise, young, vivacious, and lovely, went to Spain to find a horror. Her husband was not a prince, but a shattered man-child. Court etiquette preserved her public demeanor, but her private correspondence bore witness to profound horror and anguish. Even the wedding had to be staged with precise instruction. Charles was unable to perform the most elementary rituals on his own. The facade of an operational monarchy was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, and the world was taking note. The royal wedding was supposed to be an exuberant token of unity and power, but what it actually highlighted was how vulnerable Spain's monarchy had become. At the wedding, Charles II was actually led by hand through each procedure. He fought to speak the vows aloud, so hard, in fact, that some wondered if the marriage would even be valid under the law. While the crowd cheered, the royal couple was whisked from the sight of the people. There would be no triumphant showing, no such romantic tableau for the masses to ogle. Marie-Louise of Orleans, the young French bride, soon found out about the reality of her situation. Although she had hopes of creating a normal marriage, it soon became apparent that a normal relationship with Charles was not possible. His extreme physical and mental disabilities provided little hope of consummation. Although palace physicians espoused officially that the couple was engaged in trying to bear an heir, all of this was political drama. In secret, Marie-Louise's isolation and desperation grew with each successive year. The absence of an heir soon developed into an outright crisis. With no successor, influential European powers began to covet Spain's immense empire, poised to divide it among themselves. Within Spain, opposing factions manipulated for dominance, already expecting a future free of a ruling Habsburg. What had once seemed to be a divine right-blessed dynasty now looked biologically doomed. In 1689, Marie-Louise died unexpectedly. Poisons were rumored to have killed her throughout the court, although most contemporary historians attribute her death to natural causes, complicated by stress, seclusion, and emotional breakdown. She died ending whatever lingering expectation that Charles would carry on the family line. Spain, not yet willing to let go of the dynastic survival strategy, hurriedly sought Charles a second wife. Their last try was Mariana of Neuburg, the daughter of the Elector Palatine. But this was a marriage of politics alone and not love or even hope, It was only politics. Mariana, according to report, accepted her destiny with resignation, knowing that her purpose was ceremonial at best. Their marriage in 1690 was a repeat of the first public spectacle masking private dysfunction. Charles's health had diminished even more. He now needed even greater assistance just to stand or go through the rituals. Foreign ambassadors present reported the ceremony in open disbelief, seeing a plainly incapacitated man paraded as Spain's future. Mariana, as Marie-Louise had done before her, was crushed by expectations and confronted an impossible challenge. Behind the palace walls, she encountered a husband whose illness had advanced dramatically. Charles was barely functional physically, and the possibility of reproduction had gone from unlikely to impossible. Still, the illusion went on. Court doctors persisted in their charade, tracking the Queen's health and suggesting future pregnancies. But palace insiders knew the reality. There was not going to be an heir. Mariana's personal letters during these months show increasing frustration, terror, and grief. She wrote of her husband as emotionally immature, incapable of grasping straightforward concepts, and subject to awful fits, perhaps seizures or evidence of catastrophic neurological collapse. The Spanish monarchy was now completely a theater of illusion. Official accounts presented a rosy picture of life under the royals, while foreign ambassadors reported back dispatches that told of something more akin to a living tragedy. Charles was now the focal point of a political fiction, a stage prop in a decaying empire. As he reached his 30s, still without children and increasingly weakened, the matter of succession dominated European diplomacy. Other countries were already treating Charles as though he had died, making secret arrangements to carve up Spain's lands for when he inevitably did. The king, once regarded as God's chosen one, was now an aside in discussions regarding his own kingdom's destiny. By the final years of Charles II's reign, it had become painfully clear. The king could barely comprehend the complex political storms swirling around him. His final will, meant to decide the fate of one of history's greatest empires, was not shaped by his own hand or mind, but by the clashing ambitions of rival court factions. The most fateful document of the era was dictated by men who had long lost faith in the king's judgment. It would ironically carry the name of a monarch who could not even read it. Simultaneously, Spain's empire was disintegrating. Economic meltdown walked hand in hand with political decline. The erstwhile faithful colonies, dispersed across the Americas, started drifting out of Madrid's reach. Commercial channels that had poured unimaginable riches into Europe began to unravel as colonial rulers lost trust in the power of the crown. The gold and silver that had financed the Habsburgs for centuries dried up, just when they most required it. Within Spain, fissures opened. Great noble families that had sworn unending allegiance to the crown started quietly forging alliances with abroad. Everybody knew what was in store. The dynasty was expiring, and with no successor to carry on the tradition, allegiance to the throne was an empty ritual. Then came November 1700. Charles II rested in his bedroom in the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, his body weakening after decades of unbearable torment. His death was not only the passing of a king, but of a world order. Here was a man who had been left the greatest empire on the planet, yet would be leaving nothing more than a broken line and shattered crown. The doctors who had been struggling for decades to maintain his failing strength were ultimately helpless. Nature finally had taken its own. The last few days were terrifying beyond imagination. His ailing body, so warped by centuries of genetic elemental destruction, showed symptoms even experienced witnesses could not comprehend. He would endure seizures lasting hours, stretches of apparent death followed by jarring resurrections, and a degree of physical deterioration that appalled those accustomed to his visage. His once celebrated Habsburg jaw, now deformed into grotesquerie, left his countenance hardly human. He could not speak, he could not write, and as his health declined, influential groups battled at his bedside, each group purporting to speak for the ailing king's true intentions. His will was rewritten several times in his dying hours, written not by the king, but by the person who at the moment happened to be in control. Outside the palace, Europe waited with bated breath. Foreign capitals hummed with expectation. In Paris, London, Vienna, governments held their breath for news of Charles's demise and his hand-picked successor. When it finally arrived, it traveled like fire through a circuit of diplomats and spies who had been waiting years for this day. The man who struggled to make it through life had, in death, ignited one of the biggest geopolitical realignments in modern times. In a final twist of fortune, Charles's last will appointed Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV grandson, to succeed him. The Spanish crown, once the jewel of Habsburg power, would now go to the Bourbon dynasty, Spanish monarchs' age-old foes. The empire Habsburgs built through centuries of bloodshed and conquest, war and strife, now went to the very dynasty with which they had fought for generations. This was political irony, too. It was dynastic verse. A circle was completed in blood and failure. The empire was breaking apart. Spain, master of continents, was relegated to secondary status overnight. The War of the Spanish Succession raged across Europe, a bloody, decade-long battle over who would rule what remained of Spain's empire. One man's death, ill, childless, and powerless, had set off some of the most appalling fighting the continent had ever known. But beneath the politics and the war was something worse yet, a scientific horror that modern genetics wouldn't explain until later. Studies of the Habsburg family tree have confirmed what observers at the time could only guess. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient exceeded that of laboratory mice specifically bred for genetic research. That he survived to the age of 39 wasn't just improbable, it was a miracle of biology. Or a tragedy of it. As the European powers partitioned the leftover colonies of the Spanish Empire, they parceled out territories as spoils from a defeated civilization. France gained control of Spain, Austria claimed Italy and the Low Countries, and Britain gained vital colonial possessions. The mighty Spanish Empire that had stretched from the Andes to the Philippines was now reduced to bargaining counters on the desks of foreign envoys. Even Spain's own cultural heritage started to disperse. Irreplaceable works by Velázquez and El Greco, Cervantes and Lope de Vega's literary achievements, the Escorial's architectural marvels, all were reduced to artifacts of a golden age which was slowly turning to dust. The Inquisition, long dreaded throughout continents, silently dissolved into insignificance as the political power that kept it going disappeared. But this was never simply about the fall of a state. It was about millions of lives turned around, colonial people caught in chaos, European communities left to contesting powers, whole regions left in limbo because one dynasty had disregarded the fundamental laws of nature. And perhaps the greatest tragedy? No one realized the science in time. For centuries, the secrets of heredity were unknown. The Habsburgs, in their monomania to preserve bloodlines, had unwittingly become a living experiment in gene self-destruction. Charles II was no monster. He was the inevitable product of generations of intentional ignorance. His rule, such as it was, and such as he was able to hold on to, was characterized not by triumphs or conquest, but by agony, silence, and the gradual disintegration of all that his forebears had created. History should recall him not as a failed king, but as a warning, an emblem of what occurs when human desire meets biological constraint. Eventually, the Spanish Empire did not topple in a fire of war or the thunder of revolution. It passed away gradually, quietly, in the image of a man who could hardly talk in a palace where everyone whispered, in a bed ringed by opportunists, in a body destroyed by a family who thought its blood was too noble to be contaminated. Charles II was not an exception. He was the end. And in him we have the ultimate ghostly price of dynastic pride.